and then we call it jazz. It's cool. So we are so delighted to be here today. We have two special guests with us. I'll go to our instrumentalist first. Chuck Booth is on drums today, and this is not the first time he's been here with us, but as I said in his bio in there, Chuck has been playing professionally for 60 years, and he plays a great band. The other reason we always, he's a wonderful drummer. He's got, as they say in the trade, big ears, so he hears what you're doing and he follows immediately. Except for when you're talking. But he also manages somehow on the head of his drum to have the logo or the words for whatever group he plays with. So today's got Wild Vine Jazz on there, which is just awesome. So welcome, Chuck. We're really, really excited to have a guest here who, for the first time today at Jazz Sanctuary. Renee Rouse is a UCC minister and vocalist, as you'll soon hear. She's the interim pastor in the church in Warner, but she can really sing and really bring a wonderful message about the origin of spirituals, the jazz of liberation. So it's going to be really fun, mistakes and all. So thank you so much for coming, and we're going to get started.
Anything you'd like to say about this one?
Steal away. As we go to steal away, I guess one of the things I want you to think about while we're singing the spirituals is that I hope that when we get to questions and answers that you're thinking about questions about the spirituals, but I want you to be aware that slaves during the slavery time weren't able to read. And so when they wrote songs or sung these songs, they were singing because they had been exposed to the Old Testament by either their masters weren't willing to let them be exposed to the New Testament for fear that they would leave slavery. So they only had access to the Old Testament, and that was from certain preachers who would tell them about the Old Testament. But Steal Away is one of those songs where it also has the message that they could run away from slavery. They could steal away from slavery, and the risk was that it was worth stealing away and getting away from slavery. And they were stealing away not just to Jesus, but to the Promised Land, which was to the north. The north didn't just mean New England. The north meant anywhere in the north, in particular to Canada. So they weren't just going here to New Hampshire or to Pennsylvania or to New York. They were also going to Canada if they could get that far. So when we sing these songs in church, we think about them from a spiritual perspective. They were singing them from a freedom perspective, always. And they were always singing them from the Old Testament of when the Israelites were in captivity for 400 years as slaves. So their method of thinking was, if God could free the Israelites after 400 years of slavery, then they identified with the Israelites, that that's what they were looking for, is that kind of freedom.
Steal away to Jesus. We did. It's in there.
A good song about the Holy Spirit and about prayer.
Can you hear me?
No.
No, it's not. It is on. We did this once before, I understand.
We've already changed the cord.
And it worked for a little while. It was.
Might get another microphone.
Yes.
Do you have one?
Yes. If I turn the timer.
Yeah.
Is that channel? Try moving it to the channel. Either that would have a button that's on, it should be on. The kill switch. No, that's good.
Pardon us, we're trying to move it, we need those.
You know, sometimes they have a button. Yeah, I don't know.
What do you think, Joe?
I don't know. Here.
What do you think?
Is this a battery powered? Check.
No.
Check.
Another cord. That's the original mic.
Holy Spirit apparently wanted y'all to have a conversation, so just talk amongst yourselves for a minute, you know. Talk about the first 3 songs we've sung, or whatever you want to talk about. And we'll be right back. We don't know yet.
Biggest problem is, you have a knock.
Check 1, 2. There we go. Good.
Sorry about that. Either do it again or get your money back.
You're right. Yeah. Apparently God's eyes on the sparrow and all of us right now. So
use the word, ain't gonna let white supremacy turn me around, ain't gonna let my ignorance turn me around, and ain't gonna let my fear turn me around. We're gonna keep on a walking, we're gonna keep on a talking, we're gonna keep on marching to freedom land. Turn me around, turn me around, turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, I keep on talking, I'm marching on the falling man. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, I'm keep on running back. I ain't gonna let white supremacy turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let white supremacy turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. I ain't gonna let my ignorance turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let my ignorance turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. I ain't gonna let my fear turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. I'm gonna let my fear turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching on the freedom land. Marching on the freedom land. Marching on the freedom land. Marching on the freedom
Well, welcome to Jazz Sanctuary. For those of you who are here for the first time, we're so glad you found us, and we're so glad you're here. For those of you who've come a bazillion times, we're so glad you're back. We have restrooms in several places, should you need them. There's one through this door just to the left. You also go back out the way you came in, through the double doors in the lobby. You'll find them there. There's also a table with water and coffee out there. We invite you to grab a cup if you need to refresh yourself. We also invite you to clap, to laugh, to dance, to smile, to do whatever the Spirit calls you to do in this space, to be you, essentially, as you're here. Is there anything else you'd like to say? You said some things at the beginning, but
Maybe, do we need more coffee?
do we need more coffee? Yeah?
Carol, do we need more coffee?
Okay.
Hi, honey.
If you can tell, we're trying to make this very informal, so please do as you need. So the next song we're going to do is Swing Low Sweet Chariot, and we didn't put the words in here because we figured y'all know at least the words to the refrain. So we want you to join us in as we do Swing Low Sweet Chariot together.
Refrain this time.
Refrain is the intro. Carry me done, my friends. Nicely done. Please join with me in our unison opening prayer. Giver of life, creator of all that is lovely, teach us to sing the words of your song. We want to feel the music of living and not fear the sad songs, but make them new songs composed of both laughter and tears. Teach us to dance to the sounds of your world and your people. We want to move in rhythm with your plan. Help us to follow your leading, to risk even falling, to risk and keep trying, because you are leading the dance. Amen.
Our next song, you get to sing. The words are hush, hush, somebody's calling my name, and you're going to have to stomp your feet to keep the tempo. The drummer will help you, and I will give you the tempo.
So loosen up your leg, get your legs, your feet.
Legs loose, you know, it's okay. And if you can't keep the tempo, that's okay, I'll help you. All right, so let's all get in the right tempo together. You ready? And I'll sing it for you, and then you're going to join me, okay? Some of my people are here, so they know this song. So they just learned it. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do? Together. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do? Sounds just like Jesus. Somebody's calling my name. Sounds just like Jesus. Somebody's calling my name. Sounds just like Jesus. Somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do? Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do? Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do?
Would you like to share with me, sir?
Sure.
Okay.
I can get up. Not anything.
What else, Susie? I mean, I'm gonna get the
Oh, dear friends, this is a table and a space of welcome. All are free to come and to eat. As we gather at this table and to worship, we remember these words of our brother Jesus. I am the bread of life, and whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst.
We come to this table hungry and thirsty, seeking to be satisfied. As we gather at this table, we remember these words of our brother Jesus. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest.
We come to this table weary and burdened, seeking rest. As we gather at this table, we remember that Jesus comes to us, in those who are strangers to us, in those who are hungry, in those who are thirsty, and in those who are seeking warmth.
We come to this table as strangers in a strange land. We ask with humble confidence that you welcome us into your family, O God.
We invite you to join with us in the prayer of adoration as is printed in your bulletin. Living God, you are present in our midst, and we praise you. You are tearing down walls of alienation and exclusion. For this we praise you, because in Jesus you have shown us a way of hospitality, simplicity, prayer, peacemaking, and resistance. Because your Spirit makes a new path for us, as we struggle to live in the shadow of doubt and fear. Weak as we are, you fill us with hope. Lover of our souls, you give us joy, and we praise you. Amen. We take joy in this meal where we give our love and our attention to one another. And remember that Jesus, too, is here with us. And in the midst of this sacred meal, we set three symbols to remind us of Jesus' promises to us.
A candle to remind us that Jesus poured out his Holy Spirit upon us, giving us new life, new power, and new hope. We, filled with this Spirit, bring the presence of God into a broken world.
And we bring bread, for Jesus is the bread of life. He nourishes us, and we put our trust in him.
Grapes, a reminder of his struggle for justice and peace, a reminder of his suffering at the hands of the Roman Empire. He suffers still when the oppressed suffer injury at the hands of the powerful.
Jesus is with us in this agape feast. Let us open our hearts to God and to one another. As we share this feast, we invite you to focus on serving each other. We often have a hard time just being served, so Tim and I will demonstrate. One person's going to hold the plate. There's a lot of food on that plate. and I'm going to take the bread and the grape or grapes that I like.
You took chocolate.
I took chocolate. Yeah. And then I will take the plate and technically pass it on to the next person. There you go. He will take the bread.
Cinnamon.
Cinnamon, very good. Excellent choice.
Thank you,
And
Diane.
the red grapes. Excellent. And so on and so forth. Let us share together in the feast of love.
Okay, good.
That was a good night.
Always nice to hear that. Let's see. So, for our first reading, now that we've got all your mouths full, I'm going to invite. Let's see. I'm going to invite you guys all to be Pharaoh. You'll see the lines for you guys. And the band and I, all of us up here, we'll be Moses and Aaron. Yeah. That would maybe a bad setup, I don't know, but there you are. So does everybody have a bulletin or one you can look off of? Not long after, Moses and Aaron confronted Pharaoh. The eternal, Israel's God, has a message for you. Release my people so that they may go and celebrate the feast in my honor in the desert.
And who is this God you call the Eternal One, that I should heed his message and release his people Israel? I do not know any God by that name, and furthermore, I do not intend to release Israel.
The God of the Hebrews has visited us. We ask that you allow us to travel 3 days' distance into the desert to sacrifice to the eternal, our God. Otherwise, he may become angry and come after us with disease or sword.
Moses and Aaron, why are you distracting people from their work? Stop wasting time and get back to your labor.
Thank you. Well done, everybody.
It's 572. I'll just give you the plain. Ready on the- Okay.
Whatever, just keep playing. We'll
This reading is from the autobiography by Frederick Douglass, one of the greatest statespeople in the history of our country. Where is it? There. Thank you. And for any of you that are confused about Frederick Douglass, he is no longer physically alive. One of our leaders thought that he might still be alive, but he's not. But he is alive in the spirit of our nation. I have sometimes thought that the mere hearing of these songs would do more to impress some minds with the horrible character of slavery than the reading of whole volumes of philosophy on the subject could ever do. This is where you get that intro and then you do that. You have to wait for that.
Oh, right, yes. It's so pretty.
Well, Renee, I've been looking forward to this for a long time. As somebody who is head over heels in love with jazz, obsessed, addicted, I mean, we could go on. But, you know, this is Ruth's music. And this is, some say, the only truly American, unique art form. And it all comes from what we're singing today and what we're playing. So this is just a thrill to have you here and be thinking in this space about the power of this music and where it came from and the situations that it came from. We were saying the other day that Just for perspective, slavery was in North America for a longer period of time than has taken place since the Emancipation Proclamation. So all the years since Lincoln freed the slaves are fewer years than people were enslaved in North America prior to that. So it was in the DNA of our country, and we still struggle with it. And that's why it's important, I think, to know, our roots.
So I can either begin by giving you a little history, and then you could ask some more questions about the particular songs. Because some of the spirituals that we sing in church, you sing as spiritual songs in church and love them, not realizing they were songs used in code during slavery time. They weren't just songs. They were ways for the slaves to talk to one another so their masters wouldn't know what they were talking about. But the reality is that it's hard for us African Americans and for those that are Caucasian, white people as yourselves, to realize that when our Declaration and our Constitution in particular was written, there were already 500,000 slaves in our nation when our Constitution was written. So when the Constitution was written, it did not include the slaves. It did not include women. It wasn't thinking about children. It was purely only thinking about males, white males in particular. So it was embedded in our own history as American history. And we already had 500,000 people of African descent, my ancestors, already on this nation's land. We also don't think about that the whole development of our own land, the place that we all call home, the United States of America, was built by slaves. And they built all kinds of places that we find very dear to all of us without ever being paid. And yet, when Emancipation Proclamation occurred in 1865, for those of us who live in New Hampshire, that is when New Hampshire stopped slavery in New Hampshire. They didn't stop it before. They waited until President Lincoln filed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865. And the slave trade began here in New Hampshire in the 1600s. So we had slavery here from the 1600s until 1865. We were also part of the slave abolitionist movement, but we were also here in New Hampshire part of the slave trade. And a great deal of congregational ministers owned slaves here in New Hampshire.
Including the first minister of this church.
Yes. And so there are slaves buried all over the state of New Hampshire without proper burials and can't necessarily be consecrated unless we as a people of faith make a decision to do something about that, which is a whole nother discussion, which I'd be more than willing to have with you. But in the meantime, our time together here is just to look back at the songs of people that cried out to God for freedom, and they used music. Africans come with a tremendous amount of way of sharing their stories through stories. They were great and still are storytellers. And they told stories from one generation to another through songs, which is where blues and jazz came from. It isn't that white people don't have rhythm. That's not really true. It's just that the nature of music was brought by the Africans, and when they came, when they were enslaved, they lost their language, or they were forbidden from using their language when they worked, and so they began to use music as a way to soothe themselves. And since many came without being able to speak to one another, because even in Africa today, English is a broken language used by everyone, because if they live in different tribes, tribal languages aren't known from one tribe to another. So if you go to different countries in the continent of Africa, you will find that many Africans all speak English. That is a way they can communicate with one another, because they don't all speak one another's tribal language. And so you can speak to Africans, because they usually speak English, even if they've been occupied by the French or Spanish or other nations, they all speak English. But when they were brought here as slaves, they didn't speak English. They came here only speaking their tribal language. So the first thing that they ended up not being able to do is they came here without the written language, and they came here without being able to speak.
and they were forbidden to read, and they were forbidden to learn English. So music became their only resource on how they could soothe themselves, encourage themselves, and when they began to learn more about the Israelites, they began to put their hope in song. And so one of the things about Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, that song in particular, Swing Low, was a code for that Harriet Tubman was coming from the north to swing low below the Mason-Dixon line to come and free slaves. And she was the chariot that was coming to get them. So swing low below the Mason-Dixon line. Sweet Chariot was Harriet Tubman. She was the ride out. Whereas we sing it in Christian churches as Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, thinking of our way home to heaven. They were singing it as someone was coming from above the Mason-Dixon line, and that they would start to sing the song knowing that her arrival was imminent on the plantation, and that they were getting ready, and they were telling other slaves that they were one of the ones she was coming to get when they would say, if you get there before I do. It was a warning, and the masters wouldn't know what they were singing about. Go Down Moses is another code word. Harriet Tubman's word, her name for herself was Moses, because she was one that was willing to come and set the people free, as Moses was called to set the Israelites free. She was called Moses. She carried a gun, which always frightened a lot of the slaves because they were afraid of guns and whips, but she did that because she couldn't afford for anyone to get afraid and refuse to go with her. So they either went or she would shoot them. Because if she didn't shoot them, they would go back and endanger the Underground Railroad. So it was that serious. They couldn't afford to be afraid. Wade in the Water is another song that was used because the masters would use dogs to track the slaves. And if they waded in the water, went in the water, they would lose the scent of the dogs. And so being as afraid as they were of the water, they would be told that God would trouble the water. Keeping the dogs from being able to find their scent is where the trouble would be. And so they had to get in the water and walk in the water in pitch black darkness to safety through the Underground Railroad, which would be extremely frightening because they couldn't see. And they couldn't swim. They didn't all come from the coastland. They came from the west part of Africa, and they were kidnapped as children, and some of them had never lived anywhere except at home. And so to wade in water that was already waist deep, and to be told to stay in the middle, not on the edges, but in the middle of the water, and to follow in the dark those in front of them, not be able to see so that they could safely get from one place to another, was not only frightening, but they couldn't swim. The risk of drowning was extremely high. Yet the song Wade in the Water, that God was going to trouble the water, and that those that were dressed in white would remind them of Moses leading those through the Red Sea. And then another verse that isn't in the hymnal is those dressed in blue were the ones that made it through. And so sometimes we sing those songs and don't realize how much history, American history, they have attached to them. Because every slave that was brought here to New Hampshire in the 1600s, and every slave brought into the Portsmouth port in the 1600s that lived here or that was sold down south, was an American citizen. And they all died for my freedom and for yours. And many of them built Washington, D.C. They built Dartmouth College. They built colleges that you've attended, and no one ever compensated them, ever, or even said thank you. Many of them went to the Revolutionary War and served. Many of them fought in the Civil War. Many of them fought in many places because they had no choice. And the reality is that they were never thanked, and they were never acknowledged. They weren't even recognized because they didn't have last names, because their names were the names of their slave owners, and your last name changed every time you were sold. And so these songs really have quite a meaning for them and for me, and should for you as well, because these are our brothers and sisters in Christ, created in the image of God. And they made a difference in the kind of land we live in, and yet they were never given any kind of value. They weren't seen as human beings. They were just seen as property. yet they sang to God just like we do, for that one day they would receive freedom. One day. They hoped that freedom would come.
Could you say a word about Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child?
Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. It's a song that really touches me over and over again. Every time I sing it, I think about every child that was separated from their mother when they were sold. If you were a dark slave, you were likely to be sold into slavery to another slave owner. If you were light, you would, and being an offspring of the master, and you were light, the master would keep you in the kitchen. So you were likely to stay with your mother because you could possibly pass for white. And so you didn't get sold. Or the master would keep you for himself, even if he knew you were his child. So there was a tremendous amount of being separated from your family. Sojourner Truth had many, many children and watched every one of her children being sold into slavery. So she never got to raise them. And so all of her children experienced being motherless, which is a challenge that we find with refugees, challenge we find with addicts, challenge we find with the mentally ill, challenge we find with developmentally disabled, the challenge we find with the sex trade, challenge that we find with children who find themselves orphaned for whatever reason, find themselves in our country as they seek to get here, the dreaming children, as they dreamer children, as they come here hoping to find freedom, and they come here separated from their mothers and they're motherless. Those who are incarcerated, 95% of our prisons are filled with people of color that are incarcerated wrongfully, are separated from their mothers. And so I think about what it must feel like. Each and every one of us in this room remember when you first time moved out and you got sick, the first thing you wanted was for your mom's chicken soup, or you just called your mom and said, "Mom, I'm really sick." And you just wanted your mom to send you something, or whoever it was that took care of you, whether it was your grandmother or an aunt, or maybe it was dad. But the point was that there was somebody that played that role. And I can't imagine the amount of children that never got to be held by mom when they had a fever, or got held by mom when they were beaten for something that they probably didn't even do, and there was no mother. And so the song, The Motherless Child, is what it must feel like for anybody, but in particular those who truly experience sitting alone on the streets, the homeless, those that find themselves in prison or in hospitals, but those particularly who've experienced slavery and find themselves, whether it's sex trade or it's mental illness, that total, complete isolation, what it feels like to be motherless, is what that song is written for, of all the children who only have a glimpse of what it was like, of what their mother looked like, because they were sold before they could ever really experience the warmth of the arms of their own mother because of white supremacy. And the impact of how that turned our country into a place where we still can't come to terms with that it is the greatest sin of our nation. And we've yet to do anything about it, other than to keep making laws to make us all feel like the frog in the frying pan, like we've done something, and we keep adapting like it's okay until we're all dead, not realizing if we don't work together, we're all going to be motherless children. Any questions?
Questions, comments?
Or comments, or? It's an overwhelming subject, but you don't have to be afraid to ask me questions, so I don't get offended easily. I've lived here a long time, yes.
What would be the best reference if we later on wanted to find out, another song you have put out today, to find out the real code behind it?
You can go on to, there are websites where you can go on to the codes of spirituals. You can go on to websites of African American spirituals and find the codes. There are a lot of them. Some of them were used more regularly than others during the Underground Railroad, because that's when they were used the most. Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around was during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and it can be adjusted, which is why I adjusted it, because I think during the time that under the I Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, it was used more about how I'm not going to let the police turn me around. It was more for urban America. If someone had said white supremacy in the 60s, they would have thrown them all in jail, because we were not a country that was ready to hear that language. I think we've moved to a place in our country where we're starting to get educated. It's still offensive to people, and I think people are still afraid to hear the word white supremacy. And I think we're moving to a place where African American descent, and African Americans as well as white people, I believe, from my perspective, we're all in the same cell together. We've all been impacted and instructed and taught by white supremacy. White supremacy has impacted our educational system, our health system, our judicial system, our prison systems. They've impacted our churches. They've impacted the way we've all lived since the beginning. And until we come to terms with that, we can't make one change. Because we're just continuing to make change thinking that the rules will change. But until we understand how the rules were made in the first place, you can't make change. I have children that are married interracially, so I have children that are biracial, and most children that are in your 16 and 30 age group don't really see us as having a racial problem. That's a problem. Because they can't see because of the fog. And at the same time, those that are in the older generation think it's better because everybody seems to be getting along. That's a problem, because that's even a deeper fog. And so what ends up happening is that you have this malaise that makes it look like it's really not that bad. Why is everybody complaining? When we have riots all the time, everybody then assumes, why is everybody so angry? Well, it's not that everybody suddenly got angry. The anger's always been there. It has never left. It's kind of like, you know, when you're trying to pack a suitcase, you can only get so much in the suitcase. But have you ever tried to put too much in the suitcase and then you find yourself sitting on the suitcase just hoping you could just get one more thing in, but there's stuff coming out of the suitcase? That's what anger does. If you keep putting it in the same place, eventually you can't get any more anger in and it starts coming out of the seams. But we're a nation that walks around with our eyes closed and our ears stuffed with things. And then we tell ourselves as a nation that's not really happening to us. And so we just keep stuffing things. That's what it means to be a frog in a frying pan. It's a cold-blooded animal. If you want to do an science experiment, and you can handle it in your house, go get a frog, put it in a frying pan, put some water in it, the temperature of the frog. It will sit there very calmly. It will not try to jump out because it's the temperature of the frog. Gradually turn up the heat. The frog will just adapt to the heat. Keep gradually, slowly, not suddenly. If you do it suddenly, the frog will jump out because it will sense the heat. But if you gradually turn up the heat, the frog will just keep adapting to its temperature change until it fries to death. Totally unaware that it's been in danger all along. That is what's happening to us as a nation. Every time we experience trauma as a country, we just adapt to it. We think a leader's going to fix it, we think a law is going to fix it, and we just keep adapting to it. And then when it gets really bad, we go, how in the world did we get here? What's going on? How is this happening to us? What in the world is going on? Why are these kids going around shooting everybody like this? Why are we doing this? And the temperature just keeps increasing while the world watches us as a nation. And they all know that we have this issue with this original sin that we've not really reconciled and been repentant of. That we keep hoping will just fix itself. But it's not going to, my beloved, because it can't. We have to be honest with God and self-reflect. And all of us individually as well as together must look at what do we need to do? What do I need to do? What do you need to do? And then we'll do it together. If we were all stuck in this room together and these doors and windows were sealed, we'd have to work together to get out of here, whether I'm black and you're white, right? And if I said we could sing our way out, and you said, but I can't sing, I bet you'd learn the song.
There's a great resource for white people. The one that I've found the most helpful personally was written by a woman who was a lifelong white liberal and didn't understand, why do we all have to feel this way? And so she went on a personal journey, and her name is Debbie Irving. And The name of the book is Waking Up White. We used it for a Jazz Sanctuary a couple of years ago on white privilege. But kind of the message that I get anyway, one of the messages I get from Black Lives Matter is we have to do our own work. And Debbie Irving's book is an example of a white woman doing her own work. And it's good. The other thing I would recommend in terms of what Renee's talking about is the movie 13th. Has anybody seen that movie? It's a really, really, really good movie. You can get it on Netflix. It's really a powerful movie about the incarceration of black men in our country, done by an African-American female documentarian, and it's brilliant. And there's usually with the movie you get an interview with her by Oprah, and it's the total package of the movie and the interview is wonderful. So I think I saw Chris.
I live in a world of white people, and I don't really think about racism on a daily basis in New Hampshire, but I'm sure you do. And it would be helpful to me to hear how you experience that here and how you think about that.
How I experience racism here?
In New Hampshire.
Well, there's a lot of racism here.
I know.
I'd like to tell you there isn't, but there is. I think one of the common lies about New Hampshire, and I've lived here a long time, is that you don't have racism here. So let me help you with this. The reality is that because you don't, the reality is because you think you don't know people of color means that there couldn't possibly be any racism here. It's just the opposite. That's just not true. My kids and I still get followed around in stores if we linger too long, and it's 2018. And that still happens to us. My daughter, because I live in Pembroke, my daughter, when she worked at the Sully's grocery store in Allenstown, in 2015, when she was working there as a junior in high school, she was called all kinds of names to deal with her race, that has to do with her race when she was a cashier. And her employer didn't do anything to protect her. And that was 2015. That was in Allenstown. The reality is that because we are people of color, I'm more apt to, as a mom, to teach my children to expect it. So they're more prepared on what to do with it. The challenge for you as people who are white, who may be in that malaise that says, because I don't know anyone black, that couldn't possibly happen, is that you need to educate yourself because you're living in a world of ignorance, which is why I said those words, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm not gonna let my ignorance turn me around. You need to educate yourself in the reality that we have a governor that just made a decision that he was going to create a diversity committee. And I spoke to him at one of the Martin Luther King events that I went to with my daughter. And last year he was invited to one, and he didn't show up and didn't send anyone. And I went to an event that he did show up at, and I called him on it last year, and he said, well, I can't be at all of them. And I said, but this is the one where most of the people of color go to, and you chose not to go. So what the heck is that? And then he said, well, I can't be at everything. And I said, I'm not telling you to go to everything, but if you're going to pick and choose, don't you think it would make sense to show up at that one? If you show up at all the white ones, what are you saying if you don't show up to your constituents who just happen to be people of color? So he said, oh, I'll do better next year. So this year, when January 15th came, he got an invitation, and of course he didn't show up again. And I just happened to be at the one he was at that night. And so, of course, he saw me right away, and he came right over and he's kneeling on the floor, which if you saw me in the paper, nobody could tell he was kneeling on the floor when he was talking to me. And of course, the union leader came right over because they wanted to show him talking to somebody that was black. So I said to him, I'm the person that talked to you last year about the fact that you didn't show up to the event this morning. Oh, yeah, I remember that. I was going to do that, Maybe they could change the time of when they do it. I said, they've been doing it for 34 years. Why do they have to do it? Why couldn't you just tell the people that you went to this morning that you were going to make that one? I said, this is the second year in a row you haven't gone, so are you going to go next year? So he said, well, it's just really hard because I have other commitments. I said, this is what implicit bias looks like. The reason why you don't go is because it's an all-black event, and you're white. I said, so why don't you go home and think about that? I said, and then you created a diversity committee. I said, how many black people you got on that one? I said, because I never got an invitation. Oh, here's my card, he says. That's what implicit bias looks like, is that it's assumed that the people of color asking are demanding something unnecessary, or they're being demanding because they're not white. Like the new movie out, Black Panther. There was someone who filed a complaint that it's not fair that there's a movie that's got a cast that's predominantly black. I don't hear anybody ever complaining about a movie that's predominantly white casted. But somebody would file a complaint that there's a movie out on a Marvel character where most of the cast is black, so somebody said this is just not right. There's race, right there.
I just loved everything you said, and originally my question was going to be, how can I follow you around and get more? But I wanted to say, you talked about educating ourselves. I'm going to be on a panel in about a half an hour. I'm going to listen at 3 o'clock at the South Church. The Greater Concord Interfaith Council is sponsoring a forum about white privilege and hopefully getting to racial reconciliation. And but to have reconciliation, of course, you've got to have understanding and know the history and respect each other.
It's
So I invite you and everybody else to come
That would be
at
awesome thing to do.
3 o'clock,
at
South Congregational Church, Pleasant Street.
on Pleasant Street.
Getting involved in anything that will educate you personally on what really the race issue is about. I want to help you understand the race issue in our country is not about people of color. It's about white supremacy and its impact on white people and people of color. Race problems is not about people of color. It's about white people, because you're not a color. But you have been experiencing all your lives things because you're white. You don't get stopped. You don't get followed around. You don't have to experience people assuming. When my children were little and I went in Shaw's, I would get asked questions if I was their nanny because they couldn't believe I was a mother of that many children. So they assumed I was their babysitter rather than I had adopted a lot of children. They would never ask a white woman with multicolored children if she was their nanny. Never. They would say, oh, what a good thing you've done. In New Hampshire. Or to get called by the police, we hate to ask you this, but are you a black person? And I'd have to say yes. Oh, we got a call that your license plate had a white boy in the back at 10 o'clock at night. We got a call that maybe he might have lacerations. How can you see lacerations on somebody at 10 o'clock at night? But because I was in the car with one of my sons, and one of my sons just happens to be white, was in the back seat, and they saw my other son, who just happened to be black, was in the front seat, and I'm a black woman. They called the police with my license plate number and said, we think that white boy, this was in Salem, New Hampshire, had lacerations because he was asleep in the back seat. So the next day, I had to take him down to the police station to prove he didn't have any bruises on him. That would not happen to any of you if you had a black child in the back seat of your car asleep. Nobody would question you at all here in New Hampshire. But those are the kind of things I've lived with. Yes?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're going to make some more music.
Yeah.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you so much.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless
motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long ways from home, a long ways from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost done. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost done. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost done. Oh, a long, long ways from home. A long, long ways from home.
One of the most powerful things we can do together as people of faith is to pray. To lift up our prayers in community and to thereby amplify them by having each heart lifted up. So this afternoon we ask you to, invite you to lift up the prayers that are in your heart this afternoon. We invite you to lift them up out loud if you are comfortable, or lift them up in your heart and your spirit, knowing that they will still be carried from this community. Gracious. Prayers for our country.
Prayers for Amelia and her family and the loss of her grandmother.
Prayers for my family and the loss of my grandmother Muriel.
For our friend Emily.
Prayers for Emily.
Prayers for Betsy Kelly, whose mother Sally died.
Prayers for Betsy Callie, whose mother Sally recently died. Gracious and loving God, we need you beside us every moment of every day. know that you are there, and most of the time we forget. Even of the smallest things in our life, we forget to turn to you and seek your guidance, seek your love, and your wisdom and teaching. We need your help, gracious God. We have much to learn about how to be together in community, celebrating our diversity. We need your help to move through blame and shame as we hide from our emotions in those places. Help us move through to a place of true compassion for one another and for ourselves. And fill us with courage to be willing to stand up and say, nope, that's not okay. To be willing to stand up without fear and say, it's time for a change. And we thank you, gracious God, for all of the multitude of blessings that you have given us. Help us to remain fully in gratitude of those blessings so that we don't take a single one for granted. Amen. I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home. A long ways from home. Will you join with me in the Lord's Prayer as is printed in your bulletin? Birther, Mother of the cosmos, focus your light within us, make it useful, create your reign of unity now, through our fiery hearts and willing hands. Help us love beyond our ideals, and sprout acts of compassion for all creatures. Animate the earth within us. We then feel the wisdom underneath supporting all. Untangle the knots within, so that we can mend our hearts' simple ties to each other. Don't let surface things delude us, but free us from what holds us back from our true purpose. Out of you, the astonishing fire, returning light and sound to the cosmos. Amen. Dear friends, we thank you so much for being a part of this worship space, for coming to share and to listen and to learn, to sing together and to pull our hearts into that space where we find a deeper meaning of God and of each other. And I invite you to take that out into the world, that new depth. Every time we learn a little more about ourselves and about what's truly going on in our country, I feel like we open up just a little further. So I invite you to continue that opening as you move out into the world and share what you've learned with other people. And know that God blesses you every single day, that Jesus walks with you, especially in this season of Lent, as we transform and turn, learning to repent yet again. And the power of the Holy Spirit will walk with you, will be with you each and every day. Amen.